Okay. Go ahead and convene the Land Use Committee meeting of June 15th, 2022 to order. I'm Councilmember Scott Diener. Let's go around.
I'm Councilmember Fred Chang, if I'm next on the list.
Jay Rosapepe, City Council.
Nick Bond, Community Development Director.
And I guess I'm Rob Patantu, the mayor.
Ian Smith, Civil Engineer with Public Works.
Josie Rademacher, Assistant Planner.
And looks like Jacob Miller.
Yeah, Jacob is our new Associate Planner. There he is. He's unmuted.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I'm Jacob Miller. I'm a planner.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody. First item. Well, first of all, are there any changes to the agenda? All right, hearing none. Let's talk about Perry Avenue North parking. Ian?
Yeah, so Perry Avenue, I'm sure y'all are aware of it. This issue comes up every once in a while, but in this case, there was an email that we received from a resident about parking on Perry Avenue. In this case, there was parking occurring on both sides of Perry Avenue in this particular location, which was restricting the road down. The resident in question was the former, I don't know if they're associated with the fire department in another jurisdiction, but was aware of some requirements that go along with road access, and was indicating that if a fire truck had to get through this location, they wouldn't be able to make it through. The code also supports that kind of determination. And so the conversation is, how do we approach the issue when it came up that there wasn't enough road width for parking in other parts of the city? The South Kitsap Fire and Rescue had previously required the city to install no parking signs on either one or both sides of the streets. The most recent one would have been McCormick Woods down in Eldon Trails that caused quite a bit of hubbub and conversation there about why we are restricting parking on one side or both sides of the street. When people are visiting, they won't be able to park on the street and attend people's homes. In this case, I believe the parking most often is by residents in the area, and not so much just visiting. I think that's based on what I've heard, though I'm not as familiar with the area as I'm sure some of you folks here are. So moving forward, we're trying to have some conversation of how do we approach this? What are the code requirements that would require us to make any changes out there? And in this case, I know that there are some folks that don't support putting any parking signs up there, no parking signs, just because that would restrict people from having parking at their residence. But this is a life safety issue. So we just want to bring the conversation up to discuss what the support is for one way or the other.
Could we get an aerial imagery of the parking in question so that we can kind of see what we're up against? And then one thing I think, Ian, that you mentioned was the McCormick Woods situation. Or I don't know if it was McCormick Woods specifically, but that was a condition of approval where those signs just were neglected to be put up, if I recall correctly. Are we not seeing that? Well, I guess I'm presuming we're not seeing that as any sort of condition of approval of development alongside Perry Avenue. Okay. I'm seeing heads shaking on that.
Josie,
Okay,
can you
so
give
then-
permission to share?
Sorry?
Josie, can you give us permission to share our screen?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
Are you going to share a Google map?
Yeah.
I've got it up.
I have it up as well.
Okay.
and then
Okay,
so
it should be fixed
presume-
now.
So here's Perry Avenue as it runs parallel with Bay Street.
Can you zoom in and so that we can maybe get it, and maybe you could use a measuring tool to kind of show us where the,
Yeah, so I can just do some kind of areas that you can even see where people are double parking. In this case, there's 13
one
feet.
right there, yeah.
Oh, 17 feet. There was another area I was measuring that had 13 feet between cars, but yeah, it kind of varies because it gets pretty steep in certain areas. And so parking kind of comes closer to the street versus in some areas they can park a little bit further off the street. Generally, Perry Avenue kind of varies between 18 feet wide and 20 feet wide as you kind of go along it. As you can see here, sometimes you can park off the street, and then where it's a little bit steeper or the homes are closer, you start to encroach on the street itself. As far as code goes, our current parking requirements, besides obviously that when we restrict parking, our fire lane parking prohibited is really only has lanes provided a minimum unobstructed continuous width and height of 12 feet. And so unless it's going lower than 12 feet, as our code currently stands for enforcing fire lanes, is 12 feet of obstruction. And so, I think that we could.
Ian, is Perry one way?
Perry is two ways.
Okay,
I think previously when this conversation came up, from my understanding with speaking with Mark, is the city approached the neighborhood with the potential for a one-way street.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of opposition to that.
Yeah, I remember that dialogue. It's when there used to be, we've closed off the one end of it there that comes off Mitchell. And when
Yes.
we did that, because they had speeding and people using it as a cut through. And it was at that time that we had that dialogue about a one-way street. So I just couldn't remember if we did it or we didn't do it. So,
No.
So
it-
not knowing all of the requirements and what kind of obstructions we're looking at, are you thinking, Rob, that this is a case of which is it that you want, one side signed off from parking or one-way traffic?
here's just a crazy thought, and Ian, you can tell me I'm crazy. I am crazy here, but could we put a sign up at each end of where the two ends of Perry, stating something like, versus trying to, it's because it varies. There's places where we're fine and there are places where we're not. And it just depends on where people park. And what if we had some sort of a sign that said, is it 12 feet? 12 feet clearance must be maintained at all times on this street. Standing vehicles, I don't know what it needs to say, but you've got some, and we posted that at the two ends of the street, and violators will be impounded or something along that line.
Yeah, and I kind of had a similar thought, but leaving a little less up for interpretation, where, there is potential that we go out there and we look at, and not a little more informal parking study, but looking at, where we should have parking available along the street. And then we could sign it one side only, but not just, hey, no one can park on the east side versus the west side. Is actually of like, hey, you can park on this side over here and then here over here. And so you block off some of the areas that we would notice as obviously parking doesn't really need to happen on this side of the street here because there's no homes or residents that's fronting that. And then we designate areas, along here or here, but block off, but restrict it on one side versus the other, kind of in these other areas, so that we don't ever have that situation where they're double parking.
The only thing my only comment there is, well, at this moment is we wouldn't want too much of a checkerboard pattern of those signs
Mhm.
for hopscotching from one side of the street to the other.
Ian, is that a body of work in your spare time that you could?
I don't want to have to do it. I know, and I don't think many people have time to do that. But I think that since it is an issue that has been brought up, and it is a life safety issue, it's something that does need to be addressed. And I think that the city will fall into a point where we might be liable for something happening if this street is double parked somewhere and we didn't do anything about it since we received this notification.
Yeah.
I think that's
Plus,
where it really comes down to, is that we will find some liability if there is an issue and an ambulance or a fire truck can't get anywhere up here.
Yeah, I agree. Is it possible that between now and next month's meeting, you could drop a diagram to share with this committee for a recommendation, or I'm not, I know all you guys are really busy, but as you say, this is something we probably need to set something else aside to do, at least in the next 30 days.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to talk to Mark on as far as it's going to be a prioritization kind of thing. And so I think that I think something that doesn't need to be someone's time needs to be dedicated to it. And so who that's going to end up being, I think it's, whether it's Christian or myself, or even maybe Chris can has some time to chunk off for it.
So Ian, let's say that you drop some time into this and you see that it would be kind of a checkerboard pattern or difficult to regulate or for the neighbors to regulate amongst themselves. Are we then talking about one way? I mean, is that in our hip pocket?
There always is a potential for that. I mean, a one way or even just saying no parking this side of the street. I mean,
Right.
that's it really, we always have that ability to do that. There's nothing stopping us from it besides the fact that these residents use the street to park on there for their homes.
Well, and where I was
so-
headed is maybe, if we have a couple of alternatives, we could put it to the neighborhood and say, all right, you guys, what do you think? We've got 3 alternatives. We could do signage for no parking on both sides of the street in a checkerboard pattern. We could do signage for one side of the street. And then maybe if that's still too restrictive, we could look at signage in one way. Or one way and parking on both sides. Well, you wouldn't, no, never mind, that wouldn't work.
Yeah, I think we'd be restricting it down too much still.
Yeah, I don't know. But I guess my idea was, what if we have alternatives, let's maybe see what the neighbors think.
I mean, I know they don't want the one way, but even with one car, you can't drive this road two
It's
ways.
really challenging. Yeah.
I've been on it before and met a car and somebody's got to pull over for the other guy in the first available pull-out area. It's like almost like a private driveway in that aspect. So I see Jay's got his hand raised.
No, I just wanted to throw in a couple comments. One is, if put no parking signs up, that doesn't really solve the problem, because I can tell you right now, out in the Eldon Trails and some of the other areas where we have, no parking, people are parking on the streets.
Yeah.
On that, I mean, we're doing our due diligence by notification, but that's about it. I really
Jay,
would
it
not want-
shifts the liability. If we
No,
put
no,
the sign there and you park there.
I agree. That's what I'm saying is, so I mean,
It's on you.
right, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I would probably be leaning more toward a one-way, avenue, which would give people the being able to park on both sides of the street. So we don't get into the checkerboard, because that really would confuse the hell out of a lot of people. That's my 2 cents.
But I don't think a one-way street gives us that any more parking than we have today.
Yeah, I think
You're saying, Rob, that
parking could be
even,
on one side, really. That's all we have room
Yeah.
for on this.
yeah,
Yeah.
Because
Isn't there something called a yield street that you can do, and would painting fog lines and signing the street as being a yield type street, something that you could do to draw the 12 feet on the road, and then if you're outside of the fog lane, you can park?
is that designed for compact neighborhoods?
No, it's more for like rural Scotland. I think that you still have that issue of parking. I think and 12 feet is what we have in our code. I mean, if there's any new development on here, 20 feet is what fire apparatus road is, which this barely meets the definition with no parking. And so
It seems like a one-way traffic pattern with parking on one side is kind of presenting itself as the solution.
The best alternative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know that a one size fits all solution like that will work, because seeing from the map, it looks like there are areas where parking on one or the other side makes sense. In which case, say, what you're calling a checkerboard pattern may be unavoidable, but I think I like where Scott's going of getting more input from the neighbors and seeing if, giving them a limited set of options. But I also like what Nick's suggesting about just a lot of paint, saying, this is the area that you have to keep clear.
I think we've got to come up with 2 or 3 alternatives presented to the community, the neighborhood up there, and which it's going to be like some of the elections where you're picking the least of the evils.
Yeah. But we don't have a choice, right?
Mhm.
I would add too that concerning the one way, I mean, you're basically adding 1 mile of driving to anyone's trip who is not able to come out the way that they came in, if that's the direction that they're heading. And so that's, it's not a ton of cost to drive a mile, but it adds up over a year, and you can talk about climate and other things.
And your time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, how does that affect the rest of our traffic system and intersections if suddenly all the traffic is going down Bay Street that otherwise would come out at Mitchell or Guy Wetzel?
It'd be nice to know if under kind of a highly loaded parking situation, if even trying to do one side of the street parking would work for significant stretches of this area.
I think Fred brings up a good point. I don't know that we're going to get away from a checkerboard, because
Yeah.
the shoulder is on one side for a certain stretch, and then
Right.
farther up it's on the other side.
Right.
It's just, let's let the engineers work their magic and come back, and then we'll pick it apart.
And I
Yeah,
think
that's
it's good
perfect.
for the context that this is an older development and not up to current standards. They could even call it a historical road if they like that term. And because of that, there are real challenges with it, but there is such limited space there. I remember, driving there to Doorbell and not knowing where the heck to park. So I was parking, blocks away and just walking a lot because I didn't want to park in anyone's driveway. And it's very inhospitable for visitors. But they want to
Yeah.
live there, the view. So
It's definitely challenging, and then there's not really a good solution, especially because it's an old neighborhood and the topography is so challenging. Outside of the road, there's barely any shoulders, and that switches from one side to the other as you kind of go down the road. So I think that we will end up with some sort of kind of checkered parking, but we can definitely draw up options and see what the neighborhood likes the most.
Okay. Josie?
I was just going to suggest kind of a combination of Nick's proposal and the checkerboard, kind of outlining parking dots or parking rectangles that if it's not within this box, you can't park, and that's kind of based off the survey of how wide the street is.
So and I appreciate that. That's a good idea too. So one of the ideas, I think, to get more buy-in with the neighborhood is maybe what Josie was talking about is the best solution. Yet we can pitch it with some of the other ideas, which we already know are going to have a fair amount of concerns about or opposition to. And so we kind of help lead the neighborhood to the best conclusion that we also believe in. And that way they've got buy-in. We all got buy-in.
Yeah, and concerning one of Ian's comments about if redevelopment happens on Perry, they would have to have 20 feet of roadway. Everything on the, west side of Perry also has frontage on Bay, so it already abuts a fire apparatus road. And then there's only a handful of uphill properties where there's actually a lot abutting Perry. Those are the ones that are impacted in terms of redevelopment. And I can't see any of those houses redeveloping. They're just going to be maintained because it's really not viable to widen that road there because there's so little right of way to work with. So, I think the long-term outlook for this is that anything on the downhill side doesn't have to widen the road because it's on Bay Street already.
Yeah, I think, and we had that pre-app on that townhome project. I don't think it went anywhere. But I think that was these properties here.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of outlined the challenges with that, and I'm not sure if where that went, but yeah, I don't see a lot of these parcels being redeveloped since they already are homes.
All right. Well, have we beat this one up enough for you, Ian?
Definitely, and I think we have a marching orders. I'll get with Mark and Chris Hammer on this and see who we want to put together some exhibits on that and present it.
Yeah, so the goal would be to come back next month if we could with this committee with some recommendations.
Okay,
All right. Thank you.
thank you.
All right, supportive housing locations. Fred, I know Fred's got some interest and I've got some interest in this too, and I believe Jay does as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to put it on our agenda for discussion to see if there are areas where there may be some support or for what we're calling supportive housing. I know that three of us have different ideas, and I think that's good because it would be nice if we would be able to make some suggestions and maybe the council would also agree with them. Because currently, we say that it's allowed in all residential areas, but are there areas that might be better than others? And we probably need to sort of talk about what we mean by supportive housing. I know that one little thing that I've been curious about, and it may be beyond the scope of today's, is like, if we were to allow something like a tiny home village, where would we allow that? Or where would be a suitable location for it?
Well, I think that we've already explored this with the county. They were looking at a site up by the cemetery on Bethel, and the barrier wasn't the code allowing the tiny house village. It was they have to put in sidewalks and they have to have parking and they have to have utility connections on a per unit basis. And so the barrier was really paying impact fees, connecting to water and sewer, and actually improving the site in some form other than a gravel lot. We really don't have a standard that allows for more of an interim condition of a tiny home village. And I think that's an issue more so than just the zoning land use table.
The other major issue too, the cottages that were built don't meet IFC or IBC requirements either, which is challenging too. So whatever gets proposed needs to do their homework and know what it is they can build and what's going to be acceptable under building code and fire code.
Yeah, and there is now the appendix to the building code for tiny homes that establishes the standards, and those weren't around when they built those houses. But so at least under the building code, there is a path forward. You just have to build structures that meet that standard. But this is also something that I believe we'll be talking about in our housing action plan, which our kickoff meeting is Friday.
Okay. Do we know confidently that the tiny homes that were built don't or would not meet the standards that were recently adopted?
That's my belief. I'm not the building official.
Yeah, I've never looked at them. I've just been told that in terms of energy efficiency and insulation and other things, it's more of a backyard shed than it is
Yeah,
a tiny home.
that's my understanding too, is that there wasn't any insulation, for example.
No, they're not. They're just stick built with it's weather protection. It's not protecting you from the cold at all. Protecting you from the rain.
Well, so that's one of my interests has been in trying to see what we can do with the tiny homes that we're calling them, or that people are calling them, that were built, what, 3-4 years ago?
Five years ago.
It just doesn't seem like, it seems like there's nothing that leads itself with this. And so I don't know what to do.
It wasn't thought through very well.
Well, there was nothing really guiding anybody at the time, and it was a good reaction to a real issue that's only gotten worse.
Mhm. I don't disagree. There was lack of leadership, in my opinion.
It wasn't done the most ideal way. I certainly agree. there are models of other tiny villages through the Lower Income Housing Institute or Lehigh in Seattle, and there have been existing villages using sheds like this. I mean, I visited one, and I don't know if they had to get certain dispensations to allow something like that on a temporary basis.
Where I know, the county end of last year passed a 1/10 tax. Okay, we didn't pass our own. We're going to participate in the county's process. I would sure prefer to see things built like what the individuals are building up on Harrison and DeKalb. And I don't know where that's at in its process, but the county is going to be building more permanent structures for this type of housing. There's a tax in place. It's not going to happen overnight. But, you know, I think that's a far better alternative than, you know, the little shacks that have been built myself. But Nick, where's the where are the Canes at in that process? Did it ever get to the planning commission? That rezone Harrison and DeKalb, the old church?
I think Jacob, is that one assigned to you? That's just up the hill from our office, right? The church building that they wanted to turn into like a group home or a.
Next to the park.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Jacob, I think that's your permit, correct? Is that in for a CUP now?
I have a conditional use permit for a daycare center at the multicultural
No, that's different.
children's center, so I don't think it's the
we
same
had-
one.
We had another pre-application meeting with them just recently. It's been a couple weeks ago. We talked about outlining some of the requirements for it. Jacob, if you recall.
Okay, so they haven't submitted for a permit to rehab that building yet.
Okay, they've been demoing it for 6 months. I thought they'd be farther along by now. They paid a lot of money for that building and they spent a lot of money demoing it. I'm surprised they're not farther along.
So Mayor, you know, I think one of the, you know, again, you have 3 people talking and, you know, from different point of views. I guess what I'm hearing from you is basically that tiny houses are really dead in the water.
I would say dead in the water, but you know, there's a big hurdle, you know, as far as the infrastructure requirements and you know, what they need to spend on those little tiny homes versus the sheds that were built.
Right. And but I'm saying is that doesn't sound like there's a pathway to it. Should somebody want to do that? I mean, we have.
No, there is. Our code would allow it. It's just probably cost prohibitive for the amount of infrastructure you're gonna have to put in.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect that you're probably going to spend $500,000 to get a site ready to put tiny homes on, between the sewer connection fees, stormwater treatment, parking, access, ADA accessibility, all the things that go into getting a site ready for that type of use. If we amended our code to waive some of those requirements, or that allowed, you know, gravel surfacing rather than concrete sidewalks, or, you know, or allowed these to go in an existing parking lot, maybe there's a path forward that's cheaper, but you can't get around the water sewer issue in our code. And I don't believe that we have the ability to waive those fees. Our general fund would have to pay our water utility those connection fees in order to allow that to happen. So, I mean, you could talk to the city attorney about whether there is latitude to waive fees when it comes to homeless housing, but I've always understood that you can't waive the fees, but the city can take general fund money and pay the enterprise fund the connection fee for the unit.
I believe, as Nick is correct, if the utility is an enterprise fund, it would be a policy decision for us to fund from our general fund to pay for that.
Could it come out of the 1046 funds or whatever those are called?
I don't know.
But Nick, what if it were a lot, let's say along Sydney, that used to have a house that used to have, or currently has sewer and water hookups? I guess we would still charge the hookup fee or connections because it would be a new service building.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
change of use. So you would pay the difference between the existing use and the new use. Um, and we would have to evaluate whether that service is adequate to support what is proposed. And then, I mean, sometimes you're talking about needing fire hydrants or you have to, nothing can be further than I think 150 feet from your fire apparatus road. So there's a whole lot that goes into the site design for these things. And you know, there's one in Tacoma that I drive by on my way home from work that is in a church parking lot at the corner of 6th Avenue and Orchard Street in Tacoma. I think they have about 20 tiny homes there, but it was put in an existing church parking lot area where there's access there already. I don't know what they're doing for water and sewer or how and Tacoma doesn't have impact fees. So a lot of the issues that we have imposed on development because we're a young growing city or you know, I'll have a lot of new areas developing versus Tacoma having an established street grid where they're mostly just doing infill at this point. It's just a very different city in terms of how they fund their operations and capital projects.
Hey, Nick, just to kind of ask, has there been any studies done on as far as how the usage of water and sewer is compared to a typical SFR? You know, I know that, you know, an SFR is usually, you know, 2.7 people is the average that we have per each resident. And that's how we kind of gather how much cost would be associated with that and look at the impact fee that way.
Our code doesn't allow it. Our code was written, so multifamily units, apartments pay the same rate as single family. And that was a policy decision as part of the CFC rates setting. So we don't have any exceptions for units of housing below paying a full ERU right now.
Yeah, I remember the conversation about the apartments. I was just curious if it went any further and if there would be avenue for that.
All right, any more discussion?
I guess,
I can just share, you know, I mentioned this facility in Tacoma. You can't see it very well, but if you look through the trees here, you can see there's a church over here. They have a big parking lot, but you know, they dropped these things down, fenced it off, and I don't know what they have for restroom facilities, but it's a gravel lot, and the city really didn't require any sorts of improvements for this development. And I think our code requirements are very different than Tacoma's in terms of what's required.
And Nick, do you know anything about the homes themselves? Were they?
No idea. I've
Okay.
never looked into this. It's called the Tiny House Village at 6th Avenue and Orchard. No website or anything.
All right.
And
Well,
that's
kind
helpful
of-
because it,
Go ahead, Fred.
oh, no, I was going to say that's helpful, Nick, because it sounds like one of the easier places would be an established church in their parking lot. But let's say the Methodist church, for example, and I know they don't want to do it, but would we say they can't do it because the buildings are substandard? I mean, they have access to water. They would have a service building. But
Yeah, they could do it. I think when we adopted the codes that were part of the permanent supportive housing that the legislature required, I believe that churches specifically were identified as allowing this sort of thing. The problem is that church has to provide 24-hour access to those restrooms. And so typically they're inside the building. And I think in a lot of cases, what we've heard is people wanting to just bring porta potties and not provide permanent restrooms and plumbing facilities. And so that's really the challenge. And if there's any difference in terms of ERUs or water sewer usage and traffic, then we have to look at that.
I believe,
So Fred, were you asking if the tiny homes themselves were okay for
well,
church use if that were to happen because of the way they're constructed?
no, but that's a good question. I was thinking more of just the site. You know, a site like that might be cheaper for an organization.
Yeah, okay. Just want to
I
make
don't
sure
bel-
that we're not talking about the old tiny homes because it doesn't seem like those are usable for what we want to do.
let's say we had different tiny homes that met code from an IBC and IFC. We don't have any church groups banging on our door asking us to do this. I
Right.
believe they could do it. And as Nick pointed to some reasons why they don't want to do it. And I think there's been more than one church site considered previously, like with Commissioner Garrido's proposal, but when the church starts talking about it through the neighborhood, of course, everybody says not in my neighborhood, and the church groups back out. That's what I've seen transpire.
Yeah, and Rob, you are right. It has been handled really poorly because there was a church on Salmonberry that was ready to go. And then the county said, oh, we found another space. It'll be Calvinwood. So
Well,
one description is that, they left them jilted at the altar. So.
I think the church actually backed out.
yeah, I think there was case management issues, and the public meeting on that it was pretty clear that neighbors did not want it, but I think there was more to it than that.
So, I mean, in summary, or at least from my perspective, we do have a path if somebody wanted to do a tiny house village. However, it would be probably very cost prohibitive to do that to meet code. I'm not advocating, and I haven't heard anybody advocating of putting anything on city property, nor would I advocate for that. We do have a pathway, but it would be very difficult. And the best thing we're doing right now is, for lack of better words, tagging along with what the county's doing up at the old Olympic gym site.
Well, the tax is far more than what's going on at the Olympic gym site. It's generating millions of dollars.
Right.
And so it's just, they're gonna have to design, whether they're buying hotels like Seattle's, King County's doing, or they're gonna build buildings, those meetings haven't started, but I know their first foray into this is gonna be the Olympic gym site. And then
Right.
there's supposed to be other facilities.
Yeah, so my view is that we're taking the long view on this, I guess. And Fred, I know it's not very comforting that we've got sheds that would do much better in tents, and they'd be in a known location, and they'd have good access and to certain things. But it seems like there's too many challenges right now. And so that we're just going to be waiting for codes and grants and funding to catch up to the issue. So on that does anybody else have anything else to talk about?
Well, I mentioned this once to the mayor, and I'll just share it with you. But the other idea that came to mind that might be more economically viable is that thinking back, and I know this has a terrible image in our history, but the FEMA trailers from Hurricane Katrina, when they brought in travel trailers to house people, those are not terribly expensive and might be easier from a permitting standpoint compared to tiny houses, which have to go through the building code. And so if restrooms were made available and there were services provided in that church type setting, I mean, I wonder if that's a better option than the tiny homes from a cost and ease of permitting standpoint. But I also think that this housing action plan that's starting on Friday will be looking at the unhoused as part of that study and what code changes could be made to remove barriers for providing tiny home villages. But that is potentially another option where you could bring in, 10 or 12 travel trailers at a church to provide some housing, provided that church was giving access to restrooms and shower facilities and that sort of thing.
Who's putting the group together on Friday?
Well, this Friday with the housing action plan,
Right.
that's just our kickoff meeting with the consultant we hired. So we're
Yeah,
just
I was-
meeting
I
as
was-
staff with our consulting team.
And what the things Nick's are talking about, it's giving a path forward. A city our size, we don't have a human services division and employees, and that's why the decision was a conscious decision. The 1/10 in the city, we would have funded an employee and we wouldn't have any resources to do anything tangible with. So that's why it was important to me to, hitch onto the county's train, and as long as we have a seat at the table, and because the 1/10 countywide is is much more money than we're ever going to generate here in this, within the city.
Sure.
Okay. Let's move on to item 3, which is, Fred, you wanted to talk about well, I think it was the multifamily residential abatement, tax
Yeah,
abatement program.
I just wanted to have a discussion. I don't know that there's anything that we need to do. I know I've heard, from the Nick that this is not something that, if I heard correctly, that we're actively pushing. And one reason I brought it up though is that, I remember that when we had it and we thought multifamily tax exemption, there was an option for the affordable housing. And that was, I guess, the 12-year, not the 8-year. But it made me question why we even did it for the 8-year when, and one example is the place next to Fred Meyer has some really ambitious rents, such as singles going for, is it what, 1,500 or 1,700? And, I thought that's fine, that's market rate, more power to them. But the fact that they got a tax exemption to charge rates like that really irked me. So I don't know if anyone else feels the same way. But I just thought I just wanted to bring it up for discussion.
The housing, when we implemented, the housing market was vastly different than it is today, and potentially we don't need this tool. Nick and I have talked about tweaking this tool, matter of fact, and what we're not seeing and what we'd like to see more of is mixed use, versus just straight up apartments on greenfield development, so we can get potentially some structured parking and a higher property tax base out of this. Where we definitely need this is still, we're still talking about, and while people are making plans for our downtown, we haven't gotten a project off the ground yet in our downtown. And I think it's a tool that's needed in redevelopment sites because you find things in the ground and you have to demolish buildings and things of that nature. Do we need it on Sedgwick and Sydney for just straight up apartment complexes? That I think there could be a conversation there. And maybe we narrow the focus of it. That's my thought.
I would add that what I'm finding now that we've done 3 of these, and there's a few more that are pending, the affordable housing target, I think we could be more aggressive in making that a much lower rent below market rate in order to qualify for that. But the real problem with the 12-year exemption is that it requires us to track and verify annually all of these projects. And what we're finding, it is a huge amount of work for us to go back and audit and make sure that people are following through with what they've said they were going to do. And so from a human resources standpoint, it's one more thing that is putting strain on our department that if we get many more of these, it's going to turn into a job, or at least a half of a job, for people to go through and audit this information. So my concern about the 12-year is, number one, we're only getting slightly below market rate units, and while every little bit helps, I don't think it's a big enough discount to really justify the tax deduction or the tax exemption. And then I agree with the mayor. I think the 8-year is much simpler to administer because there is no ongoing audit related to does somebody meet the income requirement or not? How much is each unit being rented for, and tracking down that documentation. But we need it for downtown. And I think it's a good way to incentivize mixed use buildings, which over the long haul are going to give the city a greater return on property tax compared to an unsubsidized garden apartment. So right now we have 3 types of abatement. Type 1 is the affordable housing, where 20% of the units have to be affordable. Type 2 is for redevelopment sites, but there's no condition for mixed use. I think getting rid of type 2 might be something that we should explore. And then on the mixed use side of things, I think we should potentially look at keeping that, maybe tweak the map, and maybe tighten the requirement for what structured parking means, and that all parking has to be underneath the building. There can be no surface parking, as opposed to right now, I think it's 50% of the parking has to be within the footprint of the building. And that would really, squarely provide the type of incentive for what we're looking for downtown. And if somebody wants that in another part of town, they've really got to deliver on a project that doesn't have surface parking. But the part of the reason Jacob is here is this is a project that I would potentially ask him to work on. And so if you wanted us to explore those code amendments, I don't have a ton of bandwidth for this right now, but I could potentially turn Jacob loose on this and start making some revisions to that code if the committee wanted to look at it more.
I love Rob's suggestions of using it to revitalize downtown and to also encourage the mixed use. I mean, the Sidney Sedgwick buildings were in a mixed use zone, and I was really disappointed that all they did was build 3-story apartments. I don't know if maybe we should put a moratorium on it now until we can tweak it.
No.
No, but I for one would really like to see it revised so we don't see more apartments like at Sidney and Sedgwick taking advantage of something like this.
I'm okay with Jacob taking this on. I think it's important to address.
Just be realistic. It's not going to happen tomorrow. You know, it's probably something we're going to get to for sure by the end of the year. But, you know, and maybe we'll bring back something in first draft of something in a couple of months. But we got a lot of stuff going on right now.
So what is the group's feeling on, I mean, if we were to start working on this and bring a draft forward, what would you like to see happen on the 12-year affordable housing exemption? Do you want us to keep that knowing that there is a staff resources cost to doing that? And do you want us to tighten it? I mean, right now, I think the affordable housing one requires that you have to be at a certain percentage below median income. You know, like 30, I think it's 30% of your income goes to housing. If it's a studio, your rent has to be affordable to somebody making 65% of median income. I think we need to be probably just adopting rents into the code to say that a studio rents for $600 a month, a 1-bedroom rents for $700 a month, or something that really makes this less work on staff's part, because every year under our current system, the rent changes and we have to go find that information and then verify that each landlord is renting at the appropriate level. So I think this could be streamlined pretty significantly. But
Nick, could we modify our code to make them do all the work and exhibits, and all we do is verify?
I was
that's
thinking
what
the
it says
same.
right now, but that verification process is not as easy as it sounds.
So we could, so is it a third party that's preparing that information and it's the verification of that's difficult?
Correct.
Can we charge a fee to have that we hire a third party to do the verification?
I don't know. Presumably, but somebody's still then got to supervise that third party. I mean, it's a pretty heavy lift.
That's less work. I agree with you. We need to make it more meaningful so that if we're doing it, it's truly meaning something in our community. It's not $100 less than, you know, it's truly, yeah, it's got to be really meaningful. And I think we need to modify or streamline the process. And if it's, you know, we have a consultant that we hire and the apartment building has to pay for that service.
I think maybe I like the idea of just adopting the rents in our code, but we look at the current median income levels and we just put a CPI adjustment on it so that it can go up with inflation. But let's figure out how much somebody making 40% of median income can afford in terms of a studio apartment with single occupancy and adopt that rental amount.
Okay.
But I think we need to dive into that a little bit deeper. And that's probably where the most work on this is needed at this point, is figuring out how to make that affordable housing piece work in a way that is easier for our staff to verify.
I am also agreeing with Rob, because I really wanted to put the tracking and verifying onto the applicant who's saving all this tax money. I mean, even if they have to hire another person that we approve of or something like that, let's make them pay for their verification. And I hear you, Nick, that we still have to supervise that, but I think most of the onus should be on them if they're asking for this exemptions.
So I think we got a path forward,
All right.
more work to do.
And Fred, you're on a roll. Let's talk about street closure policies for neighborhoods.
Yeah, I was going to do some research and see what our current policies are. But the reason I put it there was in reaction to the fireworks. And I wanted to make sure that streets that were having problems with fireworks could close off, their street for picnics or whatever. And I believe that we probably have a policy like that, and it probably requires at least 50%. In talking to one party affected by this, I was getting the sense that they didn't think they would get the neighbor consensus to even do something like this. So it may not be so much that we need to tweak the closure policies, but
It's be really challenging, Fred, and we have a process that comes before council to close the street. But remember, a fire truck still needs to be able to get down a street, and so there's public safety aspects to, putting barricades up and having a big party in the middle of a street. So I think it would be viewed somewhat like a public event, and that process is managed through the clerk's office. And in turn, it's got to have to have a review by fire and police to make sure that it's safe to happen, that they have the proper type of barricades, that a fire truck or an ambulance could get into the neighborhood if there's a need for service. So I think there is a path, but you're right, it's going to need consensus from that neighborhood, and then they're going to need to meet public safety standards too.
yeah, it's sort of an issue that that's what I was thinking, and I don't see that it's going to solve this for those people.
Yeah,
Is-
Scott's
are the-
neighborhood where there's a cul-de-sac at the end, and they pull out a bunch of picnic tables and throw them in the cul-de-sac is different than Perry Avenue or Farragut, where these fireworks challenges happen, and it's a narrow road already. And if you tried to have a festival in it, I'm confident that police and fire aren't going to approve it.
Fred, was this a case of the one landowner kind of wanting to impose their will on the street?
Not so much that is that I saw it as a solution because and it was the Whittletons, they were talking about outsiders, I'm sorry, non-residents visiting their street to not only watch the 4th of July fireworks, but also deploy or use their own.
Oh,
And it seemed to me that if there was a way that they could just sort of reserve their street for only residential use.
Fred, it's not their street, it's the public
Well,
street.
yeah, and I don't think they had consensus of everyone, even on their streets.
yeah, that's a tough one. If you live in the neighborhood.
Now, Scott, if
Becomes
your whole
a war
neighborhood
zone
wanted to block it
everywhere.
off, yeah, you could, but I don't know that our neighborhoods are that cohesive in terms of that. So,
All right. Well, along those lines, Fred, did you want to talk about residential parking policy? Item
actually, I
5?
want to research that one because I don't recall.
Okay,
Well, Fred, I wouldn't bother. We've talked this over every 2 or 3 years, that there isn't a means to provide parking passes for nannies and gardeners. And I don't know, that's where you're going with this. And we just don't have the manpower to police something like that and issue parking permits. The parking, we've got 2-hour parking and 4-hour parking in various areas, in particular in the downtown. There's stretches where there is no parking, up by Givens, up by DeKalb Park. I'm up at DeKalb Park almost every day. I know you are too, Fred, walking your dog, and parking's readily available along that street for all day long without any restrictions on it. So I don't understand what if you live in a street that has 2-hour parking in front of it, you're gonna have to move the car every 2 hours or every 4 hours or whatever it is. And I know that's not convenient for the gardener or the person working at your house, but You know, I don't, when we've looked at this in the past, there just really isn't a mechanism for us to, you know, just cost a tremendous amount of manpower to issue temporary parking passes to everybody and police them.
Yeah, I want to look into it. I hear you, Rob, and the people who wanted the nanny pass have actually moved. So that's not an issue so much on the block. But yeah, no, I just had some thoughts, but I'll look at that and maybe put it on later if there's anything I think we can discuss further.
Okay. And then the sixth item is short-term rental owner occupancy and the effect on affordable housing market, I presume, Fred?
Well, yeah, and this came about because I understand there was going to be legislation possibly abolishing the home, what do we call it, owner occupancy of properties with ADUs, and it was suggested that maybe we would want to jump ahead and adopt it sooner. And I actually am opposed to that because surprisingly, I think owner occupancy is better for a neighborhood. And the article that I actually put in was even more extreme. It was saying that it saw that a lot of corporations were buying up properties that they were then renting out, exacerbating the, if that's the right word, the housing issue. So I just wanted to discuss if we think, you know, owner occupancy is something that we want to encourage or not. And as much as we can encourage, because obviously if the state is going to abolish it, there's probably not a lot we can do.
Well, so this ordinance for ADUs was going to the planning commission on their July meeting on the 6th of July, I believe. So we have a draft ordinance and the planning commission was going to discuss it and give the council a recommendation. And that's something that this committee, I believe, discussed previously. I was just checking as you were talking on Airbnb and, you know, without picking dates, just using the flexible option. I mean, it's maybe a dozen or maybe 15 Airbnbs in the entire city that are available. And so we don't have widespread vacation rentals at this time. That's not to say that that couldn't change, but I don't know if it's worth pushing the rental, the short-term rental issue in Port Orchard when so few houses are being used in that capacity.
So I apologize if I missed it. Is the draft code not requiring owner occupancy?
Correct. It would
Okay.
basically do what state law was proposing to do, which is to remove the owner occupancy requirement.
Yeah,
So, and the reason for that is not because we want to discourage owner occupancy. It's that what our code currently requires is that you record a deed restriction. And so we have no process for unwinding that if the state changes the code. And so the thought was, do we really want to continue making people record deed restrictions that we would have to potentially undo at some point in the future?
okay. I mean, I don't know that there's any difficulty in undoing notice to title. Is that what you're speaking about?
Yeah, but
We have a
these
form
restrictions.
that is attorney approved, but
Yeah.
we've only done one of them to my knowledge. And before we got too far down the road, there's a couple of ADUs that I believe are in the works, and I don't know. I think we're going to have quite a few more here in the near future, and ultimately we're going to have to prepare documents and take them to get recorded and pay recording fees to get this removed.
Yeah. Well, I can only relate to the county experience, and it's pretty painless. They're required to record a notice to title with the ADU, and it can only be removed by DCD. And when that time comes, must be a reason for it, and then it's simply removed. All of this is at their expense, recordation and unrecording, but
Yeah,
removed by.
but
the
it
director.
wouldn't be, Scott, if state law mandated it. We would have to go remove those
Well,
requirements that we imposed.
so perhaps my understanding is that a title company can remove those at the same time if they're comfortable doing that. Or at least that's what's been explained to me.
The argument that the governor's been pushing is this is part of the mix in the missing middle housing. And that, you know,
Yeah.
our purpose is really to try to get, part of it is just to get out in front of this. So that we have our own code versus having something mandated on us.
No, I totally get that. I think it's not necessarily a problem for Port Orchard, but it certainly is a problem that others have experienced. Leavenworth, beginning about, I don't know, probably beginning about 10 years ago, started to see this, and it came to a head 5-6 years ago, where they were having core residences in the town bought out for rentals, and they were displacing the community and the workers, and usually those who can least afford to commute. And so it is an issue.
Yep.
And Eric Baker will share with you how many calls he gets about people wanting to buy, sometimes sight unseen, vacation rentals, and that just, and including neighboring properties, and that's pulling that right off the market for what could be considered housing stock for others. And so it is an issue. It's probably going to be a growing issue until people talk about it more, but I don't know that it's an issue here, is, I guess.
Well, in owner occupancy in conjunction with a vacation rental, we could keep that without keeping it for residential use when it's non-vacation rental use. So maybe that's the compromise, is that you still require owner occupancy if you're renting the ADU out as a vacation rental or a short-term rental.
Yeah, I just don't like the idea that we're regulating something that's not a problem. If we have 12 vacation rentals in our city, I know how some other council members are going to react to this, and we're regulating something, a problem that doesn't exist.
And I hear what you're saying, Rob, but the way that I saw it on a personal level, for example, the street across from the park, the 900 block of DeKalb, there were 6 houses, and it's interesting to watch the progress of this street, as it used to be half rentals, and now I think there's just 1 left. And that's not necessarily to do with vacation rentals, but I think encouraging owner occupancy as opposed to just rentals in general, it can improve a neighborhood, especially ones that don't have HOAs. I think there is, I hate to even mention things that sound like stereotypes, but it does, in some cases, it sounds like there is more pride in ownership and upkeep if it's owner occupied.
Depends
Now,
on
of
the
course, there are
landlord, Fred.
Pardon?
Depends on the landlord.
And there are homeowners on the block who never mow their lawn. So I can understand, but in general, I had heartburn, and which is why I just wanted to bring it up for discussion, because I think, I wouldn't want to discourage owner occupancy. And I know we're not doing that, but I just wanted to see if we wanted to think about putting the brakes on, people buying some of the prime waterfront or view properties just for vacation rentals. And it's certainly good from a fiscal standpoint if they're paying into lodging tax for their rentals. But
and I can share that it can be quite a nuisance for neighborhoods, specifically those who have shoreline properties, but again, Port Orchard isn't facing that quite to the effect that others. The very first complaint I remember hearing about on vacation rentals many years ago was a girls' soccer team that had rented a place for the weekend, and it just got out of control. But we're not facing those kinds of issues here. So, Fred, what are your thoughts?
Well, I appreciate that we were at least able to discuss it. To me, it's still a concern, but I don't think the reasons that we're doing what we're doing are, I guess bad, but I just have reservations about it.
Okay. So it's just something to maybe kind of be peripherally aware of what we're seeing.
And I want to add too, on the owner occupancy thing, there is at least one house that has a attached ADU where the owner no longer lives in the building and has 2 units and is unable to rent the 2 units because he doesn't want to live there anymore. So there is at least one person who's affected by this because they have a building and it doesn't qualify as a duplex. It is an ADU and single family unit on the same water meter. And So, and there's a lot of those older houses. I think Councilmember Ashby lives in one that has an attached ADU. And so, that's an issue where the owner occupancy also affects people.
Yeah. Well, that is one of the classic issues with that.
Mhm.
Anything else? Nick, anybody?
I've got one, just what we, Councilmember Clausen threw out the idea of how can we get creative in Veterans Park? And so Nick and I and Charlie were battering something around today was in relation to potentially adding $125,000 into our park impact fee for Veterans Park. And with the idea, and the county would want, I mentioned it to Commissioner Gilder and gave him a heads up about the letter that's coming that thank you, but we're not interested at this time. But RCO grants come in $500,000 increments or $500,000 projects, 250 from RCO and 250 from the applicant. And if we paired, or partnered with the county and we contributed 125 and they did, and found a path that got the park reopened, created activity in it, and did some sort of a capital improvement. I thought that was a creative solution. So we're kicking around putting, adding that. So you might see that added into the parks plan. It would take the county, wanting to participate with us and contribute some money too. But at least this gives us an opportunity if it presents itself and a funding source to do it.
Appreciate that. I look forward to hearing how that moves along.
I think that's very positive. It's because I'm trying to think if we have a good history of working together with the county. And I think we do in some ways, but this would be a really good project.
Just gives us a tool if it came forward. If we don't do it, then we don't have the opportunity.
That would require the county to add a project to their capital plan.
It doesn't. Well, yes, it would. They don't, but not their parks plan, according to Rob Gilder, because they fund their park improvements with REIT 2. So they don't.
Well, if they want an RCO grant, they have to have it in a parks plan.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah. So anyway, just can't happen if we don't do our part, then they've got to do their part, and it'd be something down the road.
All right, well, now's the time to mention it for the 2024 update.
Yep.
All right. Anything else? Go to the order. Enjoy the cool weather.
Yeah. Continuation of winter.
Yeah. See you guys.
See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.